Nathaniel Blake stepped onto the flight from London to Edinburgh on a cold, misty October morning. The gloomy atmosphere outside the airport windows didn't seem to affect him. With a long, gray trench coat draped loosely over his shoulders and a neatly packed bag in hand, Nathaniel moved down the airplane aisle with a slow but confident stride, like someone accustomed to facing life's storms. Nathaniel, a talented architect, was known not only for his renowned housing renovation projects but also for his composed manner and handling pressure. He chose a seat near the emergency exit, not just for the extra space but because he appreciated having a sense of control in a confined environment like an airplane. He wasn't the type to draw attention to himself, let alone seek out conflict. However, no matter how much Nathaniel tried to maintain a low profile, he couldn't change the fact that his appearance, a tall black man with neatly trimmed hair and sharp, intense eyes, often caught the gaze of certain individuals, though that gaze wasn't always friendly. He understood this and, as always, let it slide. As Nathaniel carefully placed his bag in the overhead compartment, another pair of eyes had been watching him since the moment he stepped onto the plane: Clara Winston. Clara Winston, a middle-aged woman with her hair neatly tied back, sat upright in her window seat 2 rows away from Nathaniel. Her light gray sweater and tidy demeanor evoked the image of a perfectionist, someone proud of living correctly and being well-mannered. A widow residing in a small suburban home outside London, Clara believed herself to be an exemplary citizen, someone who followed all the rules and carried the dignity of a middle-class lifestyle. Yet deep down, Clara was the embodiment of an unacknowledged fear and a subtle prejudice that even she was unaware of. From the moment Nathaniel walked in, an unexplainable discomfort crept into Clara's mind. Her eyes locked onto him, refusing to look away for even a second. This man, there's something off about him. She couldn't articulate why she felt this way, but the feeling grew stronger with each passing moment. As Nathaniel settled into his seat and pulled out a thick hardcover book on the history of European architecture, Clara continued to watch him. A man like that reading a book on architecture? She thought, her lips tightening. Maybe he's just pretending. But what is he doing here? Clara couldn't stop observing Nathaniel. She noticed him checking his bag several times, his hands carefully opening and closing the zipper, his eyes scanning the contents. For Nathaniel, this was a completely natural action. He was merely ensuring his medication and important documents for the upcoming meeting were secure. But to Clara, this behavior was evidence of something suspicious. Why is he nervous? Why does he keep checking the bag? Clara wondered, her unease growing. Nathaniel's actions, which were nothing more than routine habits, became suspicious behavior in Clara's eyes. Clara didn't voice her thoughts, but in her mind, images from the past, stories from the news, sensational headlines kept playing vividly. Tales of strangers, of dangerous criminals she had heard over the years. And now, a part of that fear had been projected onto Nathaniel. Clara knew nothing about who Nathaniel was, what he did, or the purpose of his trip. But his appearance, his skin color, tall stature, and quiet demeanor was enough for her to unconsciously judge him. Clara's fear wasn't directed specifically at Nathaniel but at an image she had constructed in her head. An image that wasn't real. She didn't realize that she was representing a part of society that had, intentionally or not, perpetuated a silent discrimination, where people like Nathaniel had to work twice as hard to be seen as normal. Nathaniel, meanwhile, had no idea he was becoming the center of a storm brewing around him. He turned each page of his book slowly, completely engrossed in his research. For him, this was just a routine flight, nothing remarkable. But this calm was like the stillness before a great storm. On the other side, Clara couldn't stop overthinking. The more I think about it, the more I'm certain he's hiding something. She felt as though she were holding a responsibility, a mission that no one else could see. Clara looked around the cabin, hoping to find an ally, someone who could also sense the danger she believed was present. But no one seemed to notice. Other passengers were either reading, sleeping, or watching movies on their personal screens. Clara felt a wave of isolation rising within her. If no one else does anything, I'll have to act myself. The contrast between Nathaniel and Clara was being built like a ticking time bomb. On one side was Nathaniel, who had done nothing wrong but had inadvertently become the target of irrational judgment. On the other side was Clara, who was consumed by her fear and prejudice, feeling like the only one who could see the truth. This underlying tension was not just a confrontation between two individuals but a symbol of a larger conflict between prejudice and reality, between fear and understanding. The reader can sense that something bigger is looming. Clara was the spark, a spark she didn't even realize she was igniting. Nathaniel, entirely unaware, was simply living in his calm. But that calm might not be enough to keep the peace on this flight. Clara felt an unnamed tension rising within her. She couldn't sit still any longer. The way that man, Nathaniel, turned the pages of his book slowly, as if indifferent to everything, irritated her even more. He's pretending. That must be it. But I won't let this slide. She pressed the call button for the flight attendant, a young woman with neatly tied brown hair, a professional smile. In a crisp uniform, Emily Carter approached Clara's seat. Emily was the type of person who always tried to maintain a calm demeanor, even when dealing with difficult passengers. But the unease in Clara's eyes immediately made her cautious. "Hello, ma'am. How can I assist you?" Emily asked, her tone gentle yet slightly probing. Clara leaned toward Emily, lowering her voice, but the worry in her words was impossible to hide. "That man," she said, nodding slightly toward Nathaniel. "He's sitting near the emergency exit. Are you sure that's safe?" Emily turned her head to look in the direction Clara had indicated. Nathaniel was still turning the pages of his book, his eyes entirely focused on the text. Every movement of his exuded calm, with no hint of anything unusual. "Ma'am," Emily replied, keeping the same smile on her face. "All passengers underwent thorough security checks before boarding. His seat has been allocated in full compliance with regulations. There's no reason to be concerned." But Clara hesitated, her eyes flitting nervously back to Nathaniel as if searching for something suspicious. "I think you should check his bag." Emily exhaled lightly, keeping her smile intact to mask the irritation simmering beneath the surface. Not the first time, she thought to herself. Always these baseless judgments based on appearances. I've seen it too many times. But she didn't let her inner thoughts affect her outward demeanor. As the lead flight attendant, it was her duty to ensure that all passengers felt safe, even when their concerns were unfounded. "Ma'am," Emily responded, her tone soft but firm. "We are not permitted to inspect a passenger's luggage without a specific reason. He has shown no behavior that indicates a threat. I assure you, everything is fine." Emily maintained direct eye contact with Clara, standing firm without being confrontational. She understood that if Clara felt too strongly rebutted, the tension could escalate. Meanwhile, Nathaniel, unaware of the conversation happening nearby, continued reading his book in peace. Clara was dissatisfied with Emily's response. A sense of helplessness crept into her chest. She clenched her jaw, her eyes still fixed on Nathaniel. He's fooling her, and everyone else here, but not me. Clara's gaze didn't waver from Nathaniel as she observed his every small movement. When he raised his hand to adjust the bag under his seat, Her heartbeat quickened. He's checking the bag again. Just as I thought. He must be hiding something dangerous. In Clara's mind, every minor action Nathaniel made was magnified through a lens of suspicion. She conjured up frightening scenarios. Vivid images from news reports flooding her thoughts like a nightmare. She turned back to Emily, who had moved on to her duties, feeling utterly let down. If they won't do anything, I'll have to handle this myself. Clara sat upright, her hands gripping the armrests tightly. She felt like she was the only person in the cabin who recognized the danger in their midst. Why is no one else worried? Can't they see it? She glanced around, seeking support from other passengers. But everyone was lost in their own world, reading, watching movies, or dozing off. Their silence only made her more restless. Meanwhile, Nathaniel continued to turn the pages of his book with a serene demeanor. To him, this was just another ordinary flight. Nothing out of the ordinary. Yet his calm, his unawareness of being the target of suspicious eyes, only heightened the tension. Nathaniel had no idea that a storm was brewing. With him at its center, Clara remained still. But inside, she felt like a bomb steadily building pressure. Her thoughts spiraled deeper, growing more intense. And every time Nathaniel moved, it felt like a spark igniting the fuse. This tension, though not yet erupting, was palpable in the cabin, making everything feel heavier. The flight continued in outward silence. But inside Clara, a storm of emotions was brewing. She couldn't take her eyes off Nathaniel. Every action he made, the way he turned the pages of his book, the way he reached down to check his bag, became a piece of the imaginary puzzle she was building in her mind. She felt as though she was the only one who recognized the danger, and the indifference of everyone around her only deepened her frustration. Clara leaned toward the middle-aged man sitting next to her and whispered, "Do you see that man over there? The way he keeps checking his bag, sitting so close to the emergency exit. I don't feel safe." The man, trying to read his newspaper, raised an eyebrow and glanced at Nathaniel for a second before turning back to his paper. "I don't think there's anything wrong," he mumbled, his tone tinged with annoyance. Clara turned to the passenger behind her, a young woman wearing headphones. She gently tapped the woman's shoulder, prompting her to remove the headphones. "Did you notice that man over there? Don't you think he seems suspicious?" The woman, looking confused, shook her head. "I don't know. I think he's just reading a book." Clara bit her lip and leaned back in her seat, feeling as though everyone was blind. If they won't do anything, I'll have to do something before it's too late. Unable to endure it any longer, Clara suddenly stood up and walked briskly down the aisle, leaving behind the bewildered gazes of the surrounding passengers. She ignored the murmurs that started to grow louder throughout the cabin. Her entire focus locked on Nathaniel, who was still calmly turning the pages of his book. "You!" Clara almost shouted, causing a few people to jump in surprise. Her voice trembled, partly from anger and partly from anxiety. "I want to know what you're carrying in your bag. Everyone on this flight has the right to feel safe." Nathaniel lifted his head, his gaze slowly rising from the book. His dark, deep eyes showed neither fear nor agitation. Instead, he looked at Clara with a calmness that carried the weight of experience. "Ma'am," Nathaniel said, his voice low and clear, though not loud, "I don't believe you have the right to demand that. I haven't done anything wrong." His tone wasn't cold, but it carried an unmistakable firmness. His eyes locked onto Clara's, as if to convey that he would not allow himself to be subdued by baseless accusations. But Clara didn't back down. She only saw Nathaniel's calm demeanor as further proof that he was hiding something. "I know you're hiding something," she nearly screamed, her voice echoing throughout the cabin. "You must have some sort of plan." Nathaniel didn't respond immediately. He slowly closed his book, placing it on his lap, his hands folding together. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady but heavy with meaning, "I suggest you think carefully before continuing. Unfounded judgment can harm both of us." The atmosphere in the cabin grew as heavy as lead. Other passengers began whispering among themselves. Some looked at Nathaniel with suspicion, while others appeared irritated by Clara. The tension was like a taut string about to snap. Emily, who had been standing at the front of the cabin, noticed the commotion and quickly made her way toward Nathaniel and Clara. She passed by passengers who were watching the confrontation like an unfolding drama, their eyes filled with curiosity and concern. "Ma'am." Emily stepped between Clara and Nathaniel, raising her hands to prevent Clara from getting any closer. The professional smile she usually wore had vanished, replaced by a serious and authoritative demeanor. "You need to return to your seat immediately. Your behavior is causing a disturbance on this flight. Can't you see?" Clara retorted, her voice shaking with anger. "He's a threat. If you won't do anything, I'll report this to the captain." Emily took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on her shoulders. She looked Clara in the eye, keeping her voice calm but firm. "Ma'am, I've already explained to you that every passenger on this flight has undergone a thorough security check. If you do not return to your seat now, I will have no choice but to escalate this matter and inform the captain." The murmurs grew louder. A young passenger nearby whispered to the person next to him, "What's going on? Is it really dangerous?" Another man sitting near Clara shook his head, his face showing clear annoyance. "It's just baseless paranoia." Nathaniel remained seated, silent, but inside, he could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him. He was familiar with this feeling, being placed at the center of baseless suspicion. But that didn't make it any less uncomfortable. Emily glanced quickly at Nathaniel, her eyes seeming to apologize for the unnecessary chaos. But she didn't have time to dwell on her emotions. She turned back to Clara, her tone resolute. "Ma'am, this is your final warning. If you do not comply, we will have to take action to ensure the safety of this flight." Clara stood frozen for a few seconds, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment. No one was siding with her. The stares from those around her seemed to judge her instead, which only fueled her frustration. But at last, she turned sharply on her heel and marched back to her seat, her hands clenched so tightly they turned white. Nathaniel watched Clara for a moment, then returned to his book, trying to focus on the words in front of him. But he knew the tension hadn't truly dissipated. The cabin still felt heavy, as though one small spark could reignite everything. Nathaniel sat upright, his hands resting lightly on his back, his eyes fixed on the pages of his book. Though his focus had drifted, out of the corner of his eye, he could clearly feel the tense, judgmental gaze of Clara still glued to him. His face remained calm, but deep inside, a familiar weariness rose like a slow-moving tide. This wasn't the first time. The suspicious stares, the baseless accusations, he'd experienced them too many times to be surprised. But that didn't make it any less unpleasant. He took a deep breath, silently telling himself, "Stay calm. Nathaniel, you don't have to prove anything to anyone." Just a few steps away, Clara stood frozen in the aisle, but her body trembled, her hands clenched tightly at her sides, her lips pressed together as if trying to hold back an impending explosion. The fear inside her had morphed into anger, and that anger swirled within her like a tornado spinning out of control. "No!" Clara shouted, her voice echoing through the cabin. A few nearby passengers turned, startled. If no one else is going to do something, then I will. He's hiding something in that bag, I know it. Clara rushed forward, her expression a mixture of determination and fear. She reached out as if to grab Nathaniel's bag. I'll check it myself. Nathaniel, still composed, let his gaze sharpen. He swiftly moved his hands to his back, his motions deliberate but firm. His hands shielded the bag as though protecting something deeply personal. Please, ma'am, keep your distance, Nathaniel said, his voice low but ringing clearly through the stifling air. He lifted his head, locking eyes with Clara. In his gaze, there was no anger, only a quiet warning imbued with unshakable weight. I don't want any conflict. Deep inside, Nathaniel felt a quiet ache. Why did they always think he had to prove his innocence? But he didn't let it show. He knew any reaction that broke his calm could easily be misconstrued. Emily hurried down the aisle, the sound of her shoes clicking sharply against the floor. Her expression was serious, but inside, she felt a heavy pressure bearing down on her like a boulder. I need to defuse this before it spirals out of control. Mrs. Winston. Emily stepped between Clara and Nathaniel, her arms outstretched to prevent Clara from moving closer. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried an undeniable firmness. You need to return to your seat immediately. Your behavior is causing a disruption on this flight. Clara stepped back slightly, but the anger in her eyes hadn't subsided. Don't you see, she said, her voice trembling with tension. He's a threat. If you won't act, I'll report this to the captain. Emily frowned but worked to keep her tone calm. Ma'am, I've explained that all passengers on this flight underwent strict security checks. We have no grounds to search his belongings unless there is a concrete reason. If you don't return to your seat, I will have to escalate this situation and involve the captain. Clara stood still for a moment, but her eyes remained locked on Nathaniel. The atmosphere in the cabin felt compressed, as if everyone were holding their breath. A nearby passenger whispered to the person beside him, "What's going on? Is he really dangerous?" "Probably not," another replied. But their gaze lingered on Clara and Nathaniel. The murmurs grew louder, forming a wave of tension that spread throughout the cabin. Nathaniel could feel the eyes of the passengers bearing down on him. He didn't look back or react, he kept his focus squarely on Clara. His hands remained firmly on his back, not out of fear, but as a protective gesture. It wasn't just the bag he was guarding, it was his dignity and self-respect. Meanwhile, Emily could feel the mounting pressure around her. She scanned the cabin, catching the expectant gazes of the passengers, waiting for a solution, waiting for an end. But the situation wouldn't resolve until Clara chose to back down. Clara shook her head, her breathing heavy. "No, he can't keep hiding forever." Her voice was quieter now, but sharp with tension. She pointed directly at Nathaniel's back, her finger trembling as though charged with volatile energy. In her mind, everything spiraled into chaos. Images from past news reports, full of dangerous suspects, merged with the helplessness of feeling alone in her convictions. Why don't they see it? Why isn't anyone doing anything? Nathaniel looked at Clara, his gaze now carrying a faint sorrow. He didn't say another word. His silence acted like a mirror, reflecting all of Clara's insecurity and anger, leaving her even more shaken. Emily took another step forward, lowering her voice but not losing its firm edge. "Mrs. Winston, this is your final warning. If you don't return to your seat now, I will have to involve the captain and security upon landing." Clara stood there, her eyes darting to the passengers around her, all of whom were now watching her with confusion or disapproval. She felt isolated but couldn't bring herself to retreat. Finally, she turned sharply and marched back to her seat. Her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles turned white. The cabin's atmosphere remained so heavy it seemed no one dared to breathe too loudly. Nathaniel finally relaxed his grip on his back. But he knew that the situation hadn't truly resolved. Tension still hung in the air, like a smoldering ember waiting for a spark to reignite. The flight continued in silence, but the atmosphere in the cabin felt compressed, suffocating, and heavy. No one spoke loudly, murmurs rippled softly like an undercurrent flowing between the rows of seats. Everyone could feel the unresolved tension lingering, as if everything was merely paused, waiting for another eruption. Clara sat stiffly in her seat, her back as rigid as a plank. Yet her eyes never stopped darting toward Nathaniel. Every small movement he made, turning a page, adjusting the strap of his bag, registered to her as a reminder of the danger she believed she had detected. But deep inside, a small part of her mind began to waver. Am I overreacting? She wondered, but immediately dismissed the thought. No. I'm doing this to protect everyone. If I don't act, who will? Yet, Emily's and Nathaniel's words kept replaying in her head. Nathaniel's steady voice, his calm eyes laced with an unhidden sorrow, unsettled Clara more than ever. She wasn't sure if she was right or wrong, but the fear of being ignored grew so overwhelming that it drowned out her reason. Memories from 10 years ago rose like haunting specters. It was a winter night when Clara had still been living with her husband in their cozy suburban home. She vividly recalled the sound of shattering glass, the hurried footsteps, and the coarse voices echoing through the darkness. A group of strangers not only took their belongings but also robbed her of the sense of safety she had once taken for granted. When the police finally arrived, Clara sat in the corner of the house, hugging her knees, her vacant eyes staring at the chaotic mess. She felt stripped, not of her possessions, but of the absolute helplessness she had experienced, unable to protect herself. From that moment on, Clara lived with the haunting belief that she had to act before it was too late, to do something, even if it meant prejudging those around her. Meanwhile, Nathaniel sat quietly in his seat, trying to focus on the pages of his book but failing. The cabin air seemed heavier than usual, as though every gaze was directed toward him, scrutinizing, evaluating, or worse, judging. Nathaniel didn't need to turn around to know people were looking at him. He was used to it. Since he was a child, he had learned to endure such stares, the suspicious glances, the lack of trust, simply because of the color of his skin. He recalled the first time he was wrongfully accused. He was only 13, standing outside a department store waiting for his mother to finish shopping. A manager stepped out, eyes filled with suspicion, and asked, "What are you doing here? Are you planning to steal something?" Nathaniel had tried to explain, but his words carried no weight. The man called the police, and though everything was cleared up afterward, he never forgot the stares from those around him. It was as though he wasn't a child but a criminal caught in the act. From those early days, Nathaniel learned to keep calm. He understood that anger only made things worse, but that didn't mean he didn't feel the pain. His silence and calm demeanor became the armor he wore to protect his dignity. And now, on this flight, he knew he had to wear that armor once more. Other passengers began to sense the tension. Some glanced at Clara, their expressions a mix of annoyance and curiosity. Others occasionally turned toward Nathaniel, as though searching for clues about what had just happened. No one spoke loudly, but the murmurs continued incessantly. A woman sitting nearby leaned close to her husband and whispered, "Do you think there's something wrong with that man? And that woman, she seems out of control." The husband shrugged. though his eyes remained on Nathaniel. "Who knows? But I don't think so. He's just sitting there reading a book." Emily stood at the front of the cabin, her hands gripping the back of a seat, her worried eyes fixed on Clara from a distance. "What should I do if things escalate again?" she thought, feeling the weight of the pressure bearing down on her. But Emily knew every action she took at this moment had to be careful, because even the smallest mistake could send the situation spiraling out of control. Clara sat in silence, but inside her was an unending battle of emotions. A part of her wanted to rise again, to act and protect everyone. But another, smaller part of her began to question, what if I'm wrong? Nathaniel remained silent. He knew he had done nothing wrong, but that didn't lessen the feeling of being surrounded. He only hoped the flight would end without further escalation. Yet deep inside, he sensed otherwise, that this was only the beginning. The cabin atmosphere had just started to ease as the plane prepared to land. The pilot's announcement echoed, requesting passengers to fasten their seatbelts and prepare for the final stage of the flight. But within seconds, that fragile silence was shattered. Clara suddenly stood up, her face flushed, her voice breaking with frustration and uncontrollable tension. "I can't sit still any longer," she screamed, her high-pitched voice startling everyone in the cabin to turn and look. Clara panted, as though she had just endured an intense inner battle. She strode quickly toward Nathaniel, her hands clenched, her eyes blazing with a mixture of anger and desperation. "He's hiding something." Clara pointed at Nathaniel, her voice trembling, almost pleading. "If we don't do something, we'll all regret it. I know he's hiding something dangerous." She turned to the other passengers, seeking support, but they all looked at her with expressions of shock and disapproval. Some even shook their heads in disbelief at what was unfolding. Nathaniel, at that moment, could no longer remain seated. He slowly stood up, his tall frame filling the confined space around him. His face was calm, but his deep black eyes now shone with unwavering resolve. He wasn't angry, but his every movement radiated a determination to protect his dignity. In that moment, Nathaniel felt the weight of the injustice he was facing, not just from Clara, but from an entire system of prejudice that had followed him all his life. Yet, he knew he couldn't let it consume him. If he had to clarify the truth, he would do so, but not at the cost of his dignity. He gently picked up his bag and placed it neatly on the seat. His fingers carefully unzipped the back, each small sound cutting through the tense silence of the cabin. Emily rushed over to Clara, positioning herself between her and Nathaniel. Her voice was both firm and composed. "Mrs. Winston, I need you to return to your seat immediately. The plane is in the process of landing, and your behavior could jeopardize everyone's safety." Clara didn't listen. She waved her arm, as if trying to push Emily aside, her eyes fixed on Nathaniel. "No. If you won't do something, I'll check his bag myself." Emily felt the immense weight of the pressure on her shoulders. "I have to keep this situation under control. If I don't, things will get worse." Nathaniel didn't respond to Clara. He simply looked at her calmly, his eyes showing no anger but a profound sadness, the sadness of someone too accustomed to proving their innocence. "All right," he said, his voice low but resonating in the cramped space. "If you want to see what's in my bag, go ahead." He began to take out each item, his movements deliberate, as though every action thickened the air in the cabin. First, a thick stack of documents, neatly arranged. He placed them on the seat, turning the cover so everyone could see clearly. They were architectural designs, houses with intricate lines, public housing projects renovated to bring hope to struggling families. "This," Nathaniel said, his voice steady and measured, "is my work. I am an architect. I've spent years creating these, helping those without stable housing. He bent down again, pulling out a small transparent plastic box. And this, he said, opening the box to reveal neatly arranged rows of medication, is my medicine. I need it to manage my blood pressure. If you want to know the truth, this is what I'm carrying. Clara froze. She stared at the drawings and the medicine box as if she couldn't believe her eyes. Her hands dropped to her sides, her expression bewildered. She couldn't utter a word, unable to justify her actions. Everything she had constructed in her mind, the image of a threat, now crumbled entirely in the face of reality. The entire cabin fell silent. The other passengers looked at Nathaniel, then back at Clara, their expressions filled with emotion. Some shook their heads, while others sighed with relief. But everyone understood that they had just witnessed a confrontation that went beyond two individuals. It was a clash between prejudice and truth. Standing nearby, Emily felt her chest tighten. She looked at Nathaniel, sensing the pain in his eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Johnson," she said, her voice filled with genuine sincerity. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience." Nathaniel didn't reply. He gave a slight nod, then quietly packed his belongings into his bag as if nothing had happened. But his eyes, filled with sorrow and determination, conveyed more than any words ever could. Clara stood still for a moment, her eyes wide, staring at Nathaniel and the items he had just taken out of his bag. The architectural drawings, houses carrying hope, and the small box of medication, a symbol of a simple yet resilient life, were completely opposite to the image of suspicion she had constructed in her mind. She slowly stepped back, her legs seemingly unsteady. Clara felt her chest tighten, each breath growing heavier. Her trembling hands dropped to her sides. And then instinctively, she placed one hand over her chest as if to steady a racing heart. She lowered her head, unable to meet Nathaniel's gaze. But that image remained vivid in her mind, his calm eyes, free from anger but also devoid of forgiveness. Clara stammered, her voice growing quieter. "I didn't know." Memories flooded her mind like an unstoppable torrent. Clara recalled that fateful night when her sense of safety had been ripped away in her own home. The fear had clung to her ever since. But now she realized it had far exceeded its purpose of protecting her. It had transformed her into someone she never wanted to become, a person who judged and doubted based solely on appearances. Clara shakily raised a hand to her forehead, as if to block the wave of emotions overwhelming her. "I was wrong," she whispered, her voice heavy with guilt. I didn't know who you were. I let my fear control everything." Nathaniel looked at Clara, his gaze contemplative but devoid of bitterness or anger. He had seen this before, people carrying prejudice, not because they were inherently bad, but because they didn't know how to overcome their fears and the barriers they built themselves. He took a deep breath, speaking slowly and clearly to ensure every word would be heard. "You don't need to apologize to me," he said, his voice low and resolute. "But I hope you'll take the time to think carefully before making any judgments. Not for me, but for yourself." Nathaniel bent down, folded the drawings neatly, and carefully placed them back in his bag. But before zipping it closed, he paused, looking up at Clara directly. "You know," he said, his voice gentle yet weighty, "I've grown accustomed to proving my innocence. Not because I've done anything wrong, but because there are people who always assume I'm a threat just because I look different." Nathaniel paused briefly, allowing his words to sink into the heavy silence of the cabin. "But I don't hold any resentment. I only hope that when you leave this flight, you'll no longer let fear control you. Instead, let compassion guide you." Clara raised her head, tears glistening in her now cloudy eyes. Nathaniel's words felt like a mirror, reflecting all the things she had never wanted to admit about herself. The truth was painful, but it was also the first step toward her transformation. Clara collapsed into her seat. But this time, there was no anger or tension. Inside her was a storm of emotions, shame, regret, and an awakening she had never experienced before. She raised her hands to her face, tears streaming down her cheeks. She recalled Nathaniel's calm yet profound words, "I've grown accustomed to proving my innocence." Those words echoed in her mind, like a bell striking at the core of the prejudices she had never been conscious of. Nathaniel bent down, picked up the architectural designs, and carefully placed them back in his bag. Before zipping it closed, he looked up, his eyes gentle yet firm. "I hope you can see people with your heart rather than your fear," he said. Clara couldn't respond. Those words were too much for her. But she knew she needed to change. As Clara exited the airport, she glanced back at Nathaniel one last time. He was standing and talking to Emily, a gentle smile on his face, though no additional words were exchanged. Nathaniel's presence, his calmness, his kindness, left a deep impression on Clara. She told herself, "I can't go back to being the person I was yesterday. I owe him, and I owe myself, a change." For Nathaniel, he didn't expect Clara to change immediately. But within him, hope remained a quiet, steady flame. Because every act of kindness, every lesson of empathy, holds the power to change the world, even if just a little. He turned to Emily, offering her a smile. "Thank you for helping keep everything under control," he said. Emily shook her head, returning his smile. "No, it was you who did that. You didn't just stay calm, you taught all of us a lesson in compassion." Nathaniel didn't reply, merely nodding gently before turning to leave. Within him, a sense of peace radiated, not because he had just overcome a challenge, but because he knew that, at least today, he had left something good behind.